Hello, and welcome to the Arizona Civics Podcast. In this podcast, we will share our journey of sustaining Arizona's interest in reforms to civics by collaborating with civic educators in our state and nationwide. This important work is being spearheaded by the Center for American Civics at Arizona State University. I'm Liz Evans, Civic Education Program Director at ASU, and your host for this podcast. I will interview teachers, content experts, and civic education leaders throughout our episodes, providing valuable insights and perspectives. We hope you enjoy joining us on this journey to make Arizona a national civics model. Welcome back, everyone. We are very excited for our guest today. Jeff and I have so much to say about this guest, but really our goal for this episode is Dr. Luke Perez, who we will have him introduce himself, shared with Jeff and I one day over coffee, a precis method. And as Jeff and I are listening, I'm writing stuff down, we're nodding to each other. And both of us, being public school teachers for so long, we're like, the world needs to know this. This is such a good way to digest big information. So we're really excited to have Dr. Luke Perez, who is an assistant professor here at Skedal, the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, with us today. So Dr. Perez, I will have you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me. As you just said, my name is Luke Perez. I've been here in Skedal since the fall of 2019. I got here 6 months before the world went sideways, and we're finally seem to be back up and normal, more or less. But I did my PhD at the University of Texas in Austin. Before that, I did my BA in classics, ancient Greek and Latin, as well as political science at Ohio State University. And I did a master's at Villanova University in Philadelphia before going on to Texas. And prior to that, in a former life, I was a 12-year veteran of the Air National Guard in California, where I am a fourth or fifth generation native, although since leaving to college, I've not lived back in the home state for some time. So I'm very glad to be in Phoenix because the weather is about as close as I can get, minus the beach, and the food is really good. And yeah, this is great. I'm happy to be here.
Well, thank you. So, Jeff, do you want to kind of start off with the story leading up to this discussion? Because I think our listeners would be interested to know how this even came about for us.
Yeah. We were just shooting the breeze about something. Luke's office is just a couple of doors down from ours around the corner. And Luke is a social guy. He likes to pop in and out of people's offices and interrupt their work and chit chat. And we were in the mood for that day. So as we were talking, he mentioned this method that he used in it's something he teaches his undergrads, and it's something that he used to prepare for his own research work. And as we heard it, I just remember both of us looking at each other and kind of raising our eyebrows, and smiling and nodding about just what a useful skill this would be for us to help students to take dense pieces of text and summarize it down to essentials for the sake of their own ability to apply the knowledge and for the sake of their own ability to remember it. Certainly it struck me as something that could be very useful to somebody who is trying to ingest like kind of college levels of reading. But also, sometimes when we are giving students something like, one of the Federalist papers or even the Declaration of Independence, just because the language is so different than what students are used to consuming in the modern world, it can feel, like a much bigger lift for them to read through it than it may seem to be to us. And so as he explained this, I think both of us just woke up and said, like, yeah, this is going to be really useful, both in terms of helping our students understand civics and history better, but also in terms of preparing them for college life and the level of work that they're going to be doing later on the road. So that's what excited me so much about this. I just knew it was directly applicable to a classroom.
As I recall, we were walking to get coffee, and the conversation was we were sort of trading notes on how the high school classroom and the college classroom are different, and just the kinds of things that make it easier or harder at each of the two levels, because there are kind of trade-offs on things that you can or can't do, or levels of expectations between, the high school level and the college level of assignments, especially I think when even comparing notes from, say, a senior in high school versus a freshman in college. The student himself or herself is not really that different, but the kinds of strategies that we have to use in the classroom sometimes have to be profoundly different. And yeah, I sort of just spouted off a kind of quip, my 3-sentence summary. I think, what I had done is I said that I have these body of a bank, as it were, of mini lectures of things that I cannot assume that students know how to do, but because often they will come into my classroom. They might be sophomores, juniors, or seniors in college, and they will not have ever taken a course in formal or informal logic. So they don't know about necessary and sufficient conditions, for example, or they don't know how to structure a good paper. And so I don't have time to double back to that information, but I do want to try to give them as much of it as I can in order to help them in my class. And one of the very first ones that I do is this 3-sentence summary mini lecture, which is the first part of what you would consider a precis. And I and that's where I think the two of you really got excited. I said, I tell my students at the start of every class, summarize the assigned text for today in 3 sentences. Each sentence is only answering one and only one question, right? What's the argument? How is it argued? And why does it matter? And it's a heuristic that is very difficult to do because sometimes text can be very complicated. Summarize Plato's Republic in 1 sentence, right? Good luck. But the exercise of forcing yourself to think very carefully about, well, how would I do that? Or how would I summarize Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, in 1 sentence, that it encapsulates the kind of the essence of what the text is about. And that method can be used for text of any length, right? So it could be used for a 500 or 600 word op-ed in a modern newspaper. It could be used for these very long and complicated texts. But it's a kind of strategy that I've used in the classroom. And then that's what got us off into the full conversation about writing a precis.
And I love it because you taught that to us. And I was actually reading a book on personalized learning, and after every chapter wrote those 3 sentences. And for me, it helped me really kind of digest that information. And, I'm sure listeners or some teachers are listening to this and they're like, I've never read Plato's Republic, or, all of these things that you're talking about. So with this 3-sentence summary, how can this make text like the Federalist papers? Because the Federalists are taught in junior high and high school. How can that 3-sentence summary make it more accessible? Again, the Federalists, the Declaration of Independence, these documents that students are exposed to really from 3rd grade on.
Yeah, so that's a really good example, or that you point out, about how you're reading this long book and you're summarizing each of the subsections. That's actually what I encourage my students to do. I have a book that's very big that I will show the two of you while we're on the video.
Oh my!
I ordered this book. I did not realize when I ordered the book that it was going to be a 1,000-page history of transatlantic politics at the end of the 19th century. And I will be using this method, right? Reading a chapter or maybe a section of a chapter, and then writing a 3-sentence summary, and then aggregating up, right? So you've read a 5-page subsection, you've read a 25-page chapter. Each time you just say, okay, well, how do I take these 2 or 3 3-sentence summaries that I had for the smaller units and then build it up. And then eventually, when I'm done with this book, in a couple of months, I will have a 3-sentence summary for the book, or a precis for the book. To to the other question, I mean, how do you use this with something like the Federalist? I find that one of the biggest challenges that intimidates students is, 18th century rhetoric, right? The way that sentences are constructed. There's a lot of, flourishments, and whatnot in the text. And that's just how those texts were written. That's how they write to each other. I have, in fact, it just happens to be up, but I have a letter that John Adams wrote to John Quincy Adams when Quincy Adams was a child, 12, 13. And, it sounds like it's written to George Washington, right? But it's just a letter that he was writing to his son. There's this expectation that his son could, please inform to me in your next, when the vacation begins. It's like, what? It's like, oh, in your next opportunity or in your next letter, when instead of the vacation, it's like your holiday or your, like, it's just how they wrote. So students are intimidated by those kinds of things. And I say, look for the main points, right? If you look at the grammatical units like that, and ofs, you can begin to break down long sentences into shorter and shorter units to try to see where that kind of indicative phrase is, X is Y. And once you've done that, then you're able to say, okay, I don't really know what the rest of this is saying, but it seems like this is the main point of the specific piece of writing that I have to analyze. So if you take something like Federalist 10, it's a fairly long essay. I don't know where it ranks in terms of length of the Federalist papers, but for an assignment, it's fairly long. It's very difficult to read if you've never read it before. It's extremely difficult to read if you've never read anything, again, of 18th and 19th century high rhetoric. But if you just sort of attack it in a very strategic way and say, okay, what is the actual thing that he's saying? It's like eventually, a student will struggle for a little bit, but he or she will come to realize, well, there's this talk about this thing called a faction, whatever that means. And there's a definition of factions that he gives. And it's not clear, for students the first time, what that has to do with Republican government, right? Representative government. But, if they struggle, they'll sort of, they're looking, they're not trying to read every sentence piece by piece, but they're hopping and skipping around the text. And eventually they can come to a point where they say, well, it seems like to answer the first question, right? What is the argument? It's, well, Madison gives a definition of a faction, right? And defined in such and such a way. That's usually the first thing that they do whenever I tell them to do a 3-sentence summary. After some questions and, Socratic method in the classroom, they'll realize, well, that's not really the argument, right? The real argument of Federalist 10 is that this expanded constitution is a remedy for faction, or it solves the problem of faction that is endemic to all forms of Republican government. Right. And so there's a way to write that in one sentence, and that every student's, their specific sentence might look a little bit different, but there is this kind of sub-argument or this presumption that every form of Republican government that Madison is aware of has ended in disaster because of factions. And he's figured out the solution, right? You expand the size of government, or not the size of the government, the size of the republic large enough that you don't have majority faction. And so, well, how does he do that? Okay, question 2, right?
Number 2.
He does that by looking at factions, looking at the solutions for factions, showing how minority factions are not a problem. They might cause a lot of problems. They might gum up the works. They might, convulse the republic if they're a big enough minority, but you have the majoritarian principle that they're just going to keep losing votes, right? So you don't have to worry about that. It's majority faction that you really have to worry about. And if you make the size of the republic large enough, then you don't have to worry so much, because no two people will be in the same group of interests long enough to form a majority faction, right? So Jeff and I might form a faction that's adverse to the rights of, the common good because, he and I want some sort of special interest subsidies for, tacos because we live here in Arizona. Yeah. But then again, maybe he's a baseball guy and I'm a football guy. And so now when we're regulating professional sports, we're in two different groups. And when we're regulating the environment, or we're moving around. And so that's his answer. Now, I've just given 5 or 6 sentences that attempt to answer this second question.
Right.
But the exercise then would be to say, okay, well, what exactly is he doing that I can distill this down? And it would take me, a couple of minutes or, maybe 15 or 20 minutes if I'm new to this to figure out how to answer this second question of how he does it, right? By looking at different solutions for factions and showing how his is actually really the only way that keeps sort of individual liberty as well as Republican government and solves faction. When you get to the third one, this is where things get interesting. I tell my students that the first 2 questions should, if not be like literal word for word, if you're comparing any 2 sentences, the essence of them should be identical, right? But the third one is going to vary because it's going to be unique to each individual person who's writing a 3-sentence summary, because you're asking, why does this matter, right? Well, on the same example here of Fed 10, this Republican solution, this answer you might write of why it matters, is going to vary depending on what you're interested in. What problem are you thinking about? If you're thinking about minority factions, then maybe it matters because you're saying, wow, it seems like, when Congress is at a standstill and in gridlock and the news media, right, left, and center is saying, oh, the other side is being obstructionist, Congress doesn't work. Well, maybe it matters in a way of saying, well, there's times in which that's a feature, not a bug, because it compels super majoritarian interests and that we don't need to be as worked up or frustrated. Maybe there's a form of minority faction that Madison wasn't aware of that could be particularly pernicious, a concentrated minority, maybe in one state that, upsets, federalism. And so the reason it matters is, although Madison might be right as far as national politics, minority factions could be a majority faction of a particular kind at the state level or the county level or in my city. And that could create certain kinds of problems, right? So now you found a flaw in Madison that you need to think about. Or maybe you're interested in something completely different. But you're drawing a parallel between maybe what Madison is writing in Fed 10 and what Montesquieu was writing, or what John Stuart Mill was writing a little bit later, or what somebody else, who's writing today or 10 years from now is writing about. So you're always kind of comparing, or let me back up. It's not that you're comparing. You're always taking that last question and trying to make it as concrete and valuable to the person who's writing the summary. And because everybody's interests are going to be a little bit different, that third answer should necessarily always be different as well.
I love that. I mean, because you're right, I've read Federalist 10 probably 100 times, and that's not even an over exaggeration because I taught it for so long. And every time I've read it, I've learned something else. So can you give us another example with the Declaration of Independence, because it's such a widely used document, and it's a little bit more accessible to the kind of middle grades than some of the Federalist papers would be.
Yeah, let's you're going to put me on the spot, so I'm going to do it live.
You don't have it memorized?
What's that Bill O'Reilly meme from back in the day, I'll do it live. Right. No, I mean, Okay, so you have, if you take the text, you have this preamble, right? When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary, et cetera. That's not the argument,
Mm-mm.
right? What's the argument of the Declaration? We're separating from this country called Great Britain and forming a new United States of America, and are providing clear, concise legal reasons for doing so,
Yes.
right? How is it argued? Well, it's argued by, it's a legal document. It's argued by showing all of the things, right? When I teach the Declaration, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There's like 12 or 13 he has referring to the king, right? Then there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 sentences that starts with for, which is a subset of one of the accusations against the king. Then it goes back to more what he does. Then it questions about what Parliament has done. So it's actually giving these reasons of saying, look, there actually are justifications for breaking a union, and these are the ones. Right? Well, okay. Well, why is this important? Well, what are you interested in? Is it important because this is the first modern democracy, since the end of the old democracies, right? And kind of sets up the 19th century for this age of revolutions of various forms of representative government. That could be one reason. That it's important. It could be important for a number of reasons. If you're talking about the rise and fall of the British Empire, right, and its significance for that reason. It could be if you're interested in maybe international law and human rights, it's important because it shows how legal documents, need to be promulgated, right? It isn't just that we fought this war; it's that then we also made this legal document of this legal case that was made, because there's the section in the front of a sort of respect for common sense and the laws of nations require that we list these reasons, right? So it's like, okay, what's that about, right? And so depending again on what your interests are or the sort of the scope of the class, so you can imagine how the Declaration might show up in AP history class or an AP government class, and that third sentence being really distinct because of maybe the threat of the classroom or the interest of the students in a government class versus a history class, right? So the 12th grade version or the 11th grade version of myself, I didn't have this method back then, but if I was in both AP history and AP government, I could imagine even in the same, class year, right? 4th period, 5th period, I'm talking about the same text. I'm suddenly giving a different answer for that third question, even though the first two questions are getting something almost identical from the same student, because the purpose of reading that text now has shifted.
And even thinking about this down to lower grade levels, because we certainly are going to have, classrooms in 3rd grade or 5th grade or others who are looking at this text as well. Like when you talk about why it matters, that's a question that they need to be considering as well as they start thinking through, why do governments exist? Why, on what basis should we choose people who rule and make the rules? And it gives us direction there. It says things like, governments exist, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, right? Like, helping students understand what that argument is all about. Like, I just think this has applications, in terms of drilling down to a precise takeaway at all the grade levels that we would introduce. Anything that's a kind of a high level text that could be difficult to digest for that age of student.
Yeah, that seems right. And at lower grade levels, right? So the 3rd grade example that you just listed, it might require more scaffolding from the part of the teacher, right? So it might be an activity that they do in the classroom rather than what I do is like I teach them how to do it one time when I give this little mini lecture, and then the next class, and for the first month or so into the semester, I'm sort of ruthless in my expectation that they've done it. Right. So I'll sort of go, Liz, like, what's a 3-sentence summary for book 1 of Plato's Republic? And then there's and I'm like, all right, well, Jeff, what do you got? And you have an answer. Then suddenly there's the shame.
I feel like the Declaration is arguing that people are all equal. And there
You're
you go.
triggering me with the feel. You know better. You did this on purpose. Yeah. Yeah. Well, fine. Let me go off on a different rant about feeling. Because that is a common problem that I see as well. That I am ruthless about not allowing students to use feel when they really mean think or believe or judge. Because there's sort of two big reasons. I think the first reason is that it just weakens their thinking and it weakens their writing. I see it a lot in papers like, the founders felt X, Y, and Z. I feel X, Y, and Z. But by framing it in that way, it just lacks rhetorical force, right? Instead of just saying, this is the case, right?
Yeah.
But the larger problem is that it moves what should be an objective conversation into sort of competing subjective affectations, right? So the example I always give is whoever's president. So right now it's Joe Biden. A couple years ago it's Trump. Before that, it was Obama. If I say I feel like Joe Biden is the greatest president since Abraham Lincoln, right? And you're thinking that's wrong. It's obviously Richard Nixon.
Right. Of course.
And you say, well, look, Nixon created the EPA, Nixon signed Title IX, Nixon went to China, right? Look at all these achievements that Nixon did. Never mind Watergate. He was actually really effective in these ways. And your argument, maybe empirically is true, right? And you've sort of shown me everything. Well, I could always just fall back and just say, I feel differently. Right. And so then there's nothing that you can do that can persuade me to accept something that's true, because I'm shielding myself from having to change my mind. I think one of the reasons why students do that is precisely for that. They're afraid of being wrong. They're afraid of, maybe not being canceled, for preferring Nixon over Biden or something like that. But there is this, it's just kind of generally the way that we moderns have been talking for some time. I have been in the archives of, I think it was the Nixon archives. Maybe it was the someone else's archives. And there's a policy memo where they use the word feel, right? And you can see it on the page. They were doing it intentionally because they wanted it to be subjective. But students, I think, need to learn how to be a little bit more humble in the sense of saying, well, maybe I could be wrong, right? Maybe Biden isn't the greatest president since Abraham Lincoln, right? Maybe it was McKinley after all, right? Or Calvin Coolidge, right?
Just interjecting real quick, the opinions being expressed about the greatness of various presidencies do not necessarily reflect the opinion of Arizona State University or the CPTL.
Right. Well, again, I mean, we could get into another conversation, maybe in a different podcast, but even just to say so-and-so was the greatest president is a problematic sentence, because great by what standard, right? Policy achievements, number of terms, public opinion polls, right? So there are actually ways in which you can even begin to pick that apart. Although that's when I am teaching this problem in the classroom, I do sort of raise all those points, because that might be the reason why you would say Biden or Nixon or McKinley or Coolidge or whomever is the greatest 20th century or 21st century, president. So there are reasons why you can do that, but there is this kind of prior problem that I see of just using the word feel when, you don't even need to say it, right? I was taught in high school English, like, I think, I feel, you could just, I feel that, I think that, you just line that out when you're revising your sentence and just say indicatively, this is the state of the world. You know, it's what I think because I wrote it. Right.
Yeah.
When I'm talking about third person, Madison thought X, Y, and Z. Right. It's important to distinguish between that thinking and that feeling. Right. There are times in which we do feel things about politics. Right. We Americans felt generally afraid after 9/11. Right. Or whenever there's a landmark Supreme Court case decision, right? Doesn't matter what really the topic is, a kind of polarizing issue. Americans on both sides of that issue feel a specific way about it. They feel good about the decision, or they feel bad about the decision. And those are legitimate feelings, right? That we sort of want to validate the experience of what's happening, but it becomes harder when then we're conflating those sort of legitimate feelings, right? I feel great about the XYZ decision, right? I feel like the XYZ decision is correct or incorrect, right? Now I'm using feel ambiguously. I'm using it to try to capture two different phenomenons. And so that's sort of the other reason why I sort of really stress against the feeling in the classroom. And in the college classroom, I think it's obviously a lot different. Like, I just cut students off. Do you think or do you feel? And then I go into it. And then the rest of the semester, there's always one or two students, and it becomes a kind of running joke that they're trying not to use feel, but they just sort of lapse into it, and they always sort of catch themselves, But I don't know if you could do that in a, K through 12 classroom sort of, but it is something you could point out and maybe work and teach and do in a different way, though.
It is important to, like, in a classroom setting, when you say I feel, I mean, those are people's feelings, right? But if I were to say, I think Richard Nixon was the best foreign policy president, I'm inviting a conversation as opposed to just saying, this is what I feel, and you're going to take it in the end. And really, one of the tenets of the EAD, right, is civic friendship and civic discourse. And the ability to have a conversation without it becoming about feeling, because can you hear him whining?
Nope.
I'll cut that out. When you saying I think allows people to attack the idea. When you say I feel, a lot of times the person is attacked. Does that make sense?
No, it does, so which is a kind of irony, because the reason people use feel is because they think it guards them. But then when you disagree with them, then it's personal, rather than saying, I think X, Y, and Z, then suddenly it's about this. Again, I say objective in the sense that it exists between the two people, right? You could look at something and you're both standing back from it. And so you could say, well, I think that Richard Nixon was one of the greatest foreign policy presidents of the 20th century. I personally don't really think that, but I do think he was underrated. I do think he was sort of misunderstood. Nevertheless, if I'm saying he's top 3 of the 20th century, then now it invites that conversation. Well, by what standard? Right.
And let's discuss what's the evidence, right? Like we can actually have that conversation now. So
exactly. I often give like a sports example in the classroom. The first couple of times I'm teaching this, I went to the Ohio State University. I have a lot of feelings about how the Buckeyes are going to do every year, and those feelings are immune to rational empirical discourse, right? On the other hand, if you were to ask me, to put money down, right, then my feelings don't matter, right? Then I have to be sort of objective, right? When I'm filling out my bracket, for basketball every March, my feelings about the Buckeyes and about Villanova, I'm in it to win it, but I'm also a rationalist when I fill out my bracket. And there's times when I say, look, I mean, I love this team. I'm going to root for them to bust my bracket, but objectively, they're not the best team this year, right? Or something like that, right? And so those two things do overlap. They are sort of, legitimate, valid phenomenons, thinking and feeling. But that distinction between thinking and feeling needs to be recognized so that the conversations we have about politics and to have disagreements about politics in a civic way, it's very important then to prioritize the role of thinking or framing what we think, right, in a more careful, deliberate, rational, right, objective way, and not be afraid that someone's going to disagree with us, because somebody's going to disagree with us.
Mm-hmm.
And so just by accepting that and then by leaning into it and say, well, I'm sure you disagree, but here's my thinking, right? And that then it's a real conversation, rather than, right, if it really is just feeling, if Liz feels one way and I feel a different way, and we're not really talking rationally, then the way that we're going to solve this is with force, right? Either because I have more people voting for me or not, and it doesn't matter if we're violating someone's rights because we're a majority faction and we say we have the majority, right? Or it's going to be real force, right? It's going to be violence rather than discourse, and that's the sort of the counterintuitive logic of using feeling. I feel like this is the case. Madison felt this was the case. Is that we use that, or people use that to thinking they're protecting themselves from criticism, but it just makes the disagreement that much more contentious.
And this is such a great way to set up Socratic seminars in classrooms to really get kids to start having conversations about difficult texts, or I'm thinking from somebody who is an AP Gov teacher, Supreme Court cases, because the justices aren't feeling, right? They're thinking and they're saying, this is what it is. And this is just such an important way of looking and really breaking down documents. Is there any final thoughts that you want our listeners to really take from this? And listeners, we have a PDF that we've made. We will put it in the show notes. We will have lots of different things for you after this, but are there any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, sometimes it's hard to know what to add, right? I will say that the 3-sentence summary is only the first part of a precis, right? A larger precis begins with the 3-sentence summary, and then after that, all of the more complicated parts of an argument can be there. It could be a more fleshed out, detailed outline of the book, and that takes 5 or 6 pages to outline a 700-page book. Or maybe it's an economics piece, and you just have a summary of the regression tables that were included to remind you of what was important. Or maybe while thinking about the argument, you doodled a diagram of some sort of causal relationship. So there's other things that you might include in a fuller precis that summarizes the piece of text. But I think the two things that they can keep in mind then are the 3-sentence summary is just the first piece of the puzzle, but it's a very good kind of first piece of the puzzle. And then secondly, just keep iterating. I stumbled on how to do a 3-sentence summary by accident, really. I knew about precis. I'd sort of seen it and been taught how to do it. In college, I didn't do them very well, but I tried. I learned a little bit from this person. I learned a little bit from someone else. And then somewhere along the way, I found somebody else mentioning this 3-sentence summary. I think it was an older grad student who was teaching it to his students, but he didn't have this kind of larger precis method that he was working on. And I saw that, I was like, oh, that's fantastic. Like, this is kind of what I'm trying to do in the first part of my precis that I'm writing. And even then, it was a long time before I figured out how to teach it well in the classroom, right? It was just sort of something that I was doing. To, in graduate school, you're reading 200 to 300 pages per week per class, and you're expected over the course of a semester to be able to know how something you've read in week 13 or 14, relates to what you read in week 1 of 2 semesters ago. And so I learned, it took me a long time to figure out how to do that. And so for anyone who's listening and trying to apply it to the classroom, like, if it falls flat, if the students don't get it, if you're not sure how to do it, it doesn't matter. Just keep doing it. Just keep doubling back to it, and circle back to it as often as you think you need to until you figure it out. And you might find something that about writing a 3-sentence summary, about writing a precis that I haven't figured out, that just really works because you're teaching a different grade level or a different subject than how I've adapted it for my own purposes.
Yeah. And even if the skill doesn't work for a teacher trying to get their students to drill down, like, what they want to know out of this specific text, like the continued practice of that through the semester, I really feel like is one of those just skills or competencies that we want kids to come out of especially high school with for college and career readiness. I just think it's a wonderful ability to have beyond just knowing the content.
No, that's absolutely true. I mean, I think that drilling this repetitively, right, that's how you learn, right? If you look at elite musicians or elite athletes and you look at what they're doing when they practice, right, they're not playing a game, right? Baseball players don't scrimmage at practice, right? They go in and they drill certain moves, at shortstop, how to pick up and throw to first base, and they'll just do it over and over and over again. Or golfers, they'll just swing and have high-speed cameras look at themselves, record themselves so that they can go back and see what they're getting right and wrong, that kind of deliberate iteration, but they're drilling it over and over and over again. Musicians, maybe right before a recital are playing whole pieces, but most of the time they're just going over chords and progressions, and they're exercising the muscles, and they'll play a 3-minute piece, section of a piece, over and over and over again until it's muscle memory, right? Doing a 3-sentence summary is not that different, right? And so doing a 3-sentence summary for Fed 10, for 30 minutes and struggling with it and setting it down, and then doing it again in 3 days without looking at your earlier version, but just looking at your notes, your underlining and your annotations of the text, and then putting it down, and then coming back to it in a few days and doing it again. Right. That hones the skill. And so you have to drill it, and you have to kind of keep coming back to it, the method, as well as applying the method to the same text, sometimes multiple times, because as I was saying kind of in the beginning, the first time you'll do a precis on Fed 10, students will misidentify what the real argument is. You can only imagine what it's like for the Declaration or for any of the other Federalists or for anything else that you might be teaching in the classroom.
It's a skill. It's like you said, like anything else, we're teaching students skills, and skills aren't perfected the first time. I mean, when you told me about this, I went through a book. It was 12 chapters, and I did it 12 times. And as I was going through the chapters, I went back to previous ones and was like, no, this isn't right. And that's the process of learning. And that's the cool thing about learning is you're just going to continue. You're going to make mistakes. And I'm glad that you said that. I think that trying it with your students, the burden there should be on the student to say, here is what I think it says. And to have those conversations, your example with Madison, if kids say, well, he's arguing about factions, okay, what specifically is he arguing? Show me in the text, and really kind of driving them to that. So Dr. Perez, thank you so much for giving us your time today. We are very grateful. I know, again, Jeff and I were so excited about this. We were appreciative that you taught an extra class in our teacher event this summer. The teachers loved it. It was one of their very favorite pieces. So thank you very much for your time. We very much appreciate you.
Happy to do it. Happy to talk about it. I was surprised how well it went over when I taught. I think of the 3-sentence summary as advanced common sense, but I think sometimes I forget how little what seems like common sense, because it seemed like oh duh, that's what I should be doing when I was learning this method. Maybe I'm the only one who doesn't know how to do it. And then you realize, oh, like this is just a lost art form. Like this is something we all used to do, and that there's a lot of teachers out there who are going to look at this method and say, oh yeah, this is totally obvious. Why didn't I learn this 5 years, 10 years, 15 years ago? And so I'm happy to sort of share what I figured out, and I sort of hope that all the listeners in the audience of your podcast figure out a way to do it even better.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, sir. We appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Just wanted to give a heads up that you can find the Center for American Civics on all social media channels as ASU Civics. We love connecting with our community and sharing our thoughts on the issues that matter to us. So if you're interested in our content or just want to say hi, don't hesitate to give us a follow. Plus, we always include any relevant links in our podcast show notes, so be sure to check those out too. Thanks for being a part of our journey.